people, I stand before you this day here in a place I have been before. And I've got my hat on for a moment because I see some Brady disciples here with their photographs. And I thought that I would, for the moment, stand here with my cigar, which I will not smoke in the house of the Lord, my gloves, and the hat firmly on my head. I have written rather, that I wore my hat low over my eyes, level upon my head, tilted neither to the right nor to the left. Something biblical about that, isn't it? And I had it on most of the time. And the cigar, the ever-present cigar that I picked up at Fort Donelson, I was a pipe smoker until Donelson, and then Admiral Foote, on that boat conference that I had with him the morning of the 15th, gave me a cigar. Now, Admiral Foote is a staunch, rock-ribbed Christian who preaches Sundays, and his entire crew is required to attend. I joked with him that he's the only preacher I know who has 100% attendance on Sunday morning. And he gave me a cigar that at the end of the day, I still had the cigar. And then over the next few weeks, I began to get hundreds of boxes of cigars, numbering into the thousands. I gave them to my staff, I gave them to the men up and down Camp Street, I gave them to the camp in general, and they still kept coming in. Although I prefer a pipe, if you smoke them, if you got them, smoke them. But I will not light it in here, and now will be appropriate for the church. You see on my shoulders what Julia likes to tease me and say a galaxy of stars. In private, personally, I like to think so too. I am the first Lieutenant General since George Washington. I have people occasionally tell me, but when Phil Scott had them, and I say, yes, he did. I see you shaking your head in agreement. He was a brevet, give this man a star. He was a brevet Lieutenant General, given in honor of his great victories in the Mexican War and his leadership up to the outbreak of the war between the states. I hold it officially, and thereby hangs a bit of a tale to bring you here. Now, Mr. Mikowski, whom I have met since I have been here in the 21st century, give me the high sign, and since we're in still contested rebel territory, he is going to hold up, for my recognition, all 5 fingers to let me know that my time is coming to a close. There are other gestures that I get free. But I pay them no mind. We're all countrymen. Well, it all began for me back in the fall of '63 when the 38th Congress opened up, and my champion out of Illinois, Galena, Illinois, introduced the bill to resurrect the rank of Lieutenant General, the first one since George Washington. And then it went into when the 30th Congress opened in December of '63. Then it went, now I had been proud of this, but I cared not for it. In fact, I had written some letters to different individuals that said, I don't care for this, I'd rather be in the field, I have the war to win. And I have no desire to be in Washington City. Washington City is a sewer. In every sense of the word. And I did not want to be there, although my name had been bandied about to be a Lieutenant General. You see, President Lincoln, after going through, I think, 7 if you count with George McClellan twice. George certainly does. But he wanted a commander for the Army of the Potomac. I did not want to be the Army of the Potomac commanding officer. But the bill was introduced and it went into Congress. Now, the month of January of 1864, it was in the House of Representatives. And it was amended and talked about, cussed about, and amended. James Garfield, Congressman Garfield, objected to my being named specifically. He said we should not name this. And I believe it was also suggested that perhaps we should wait until the war is over and then we will name a lieutenant general to succeed George Washington. Now, I'm the second lieutenant general. Now, Winfield Scott had it as a brevet. He proudly and deservedly wore the 3-star rank, but he did not hold the 3-star rank. And I didn't want to topple him from that lofty perch, but it went into Congress. And that first month or so of January, they debated back and forth. Well, Garfield said, why don't we wait and give it to the most deserving gentleman? And strike Grant's name, because I was specifically named. And that did, in the House of Representatives, the name stayed on the bill. But they bandied about, debated for about a month or so, and then in February it went to the United States Senate. Well, then you got Thad up there and the senators, and they're arguing and debating over what to do. Charles Sumner is leading the charge, and they're debating what to do. The first thing they did, as I understand, was strike my name. And I was all right with that. I am not in this for an ego contest. We need to win the war. That's what we're about. That is why you are here this day. We've got to win the war. And it is not going well, particularly these last couple of weeks since we crossed the Rapidan. But in the arguing, the debating back and forth, they finally struck my name specifically, and I'm fine with that. No man should be, in my opinion, named specifically to hold a lofty rank, or any rank for that matter. And they passed the bill. And I would love to tell you that it was unanimous in the House and in the Senate, but it was not. The House passed it, I think it was 119 to 17 opposing. I don't know who the 17 were, perhaps I'll find out. In the Senate, it was passed 33 to 6, 32 to 6. So it wasn't unanimous in either house. There were people who did not want me for various reasons to hold the rank of lieutenant general. But it passed nevertheless. Now, President Lincoln was not, he was enthusiastic about me getting the rank, but then he got word, I think, that I had a little taste. I think that President Lincoln said himself, once you get that taste of the presidency in your mouth, it's real hard to get rid of. And he was afraid that I was going to be a challenger to him in the 64 elections. And he should have been. He was just about the most unpopular man in the country going into 1864, and he was very concerned he was not going to win the presidency for his second term. Well, he thought I had the bug to be the president, and I did not. A friend of his in Quincy, Illinois, wrote me a letter asking me if I was going to run. I said, I can't think of a worse fate that could befall me than to be elected president. A fellow out of Kentucky wrote me another letter and urged me to be the nominee for the Democratic Party. Both parties wanted me, but the Republicans had their convention first, and they named it. But I was getting letters from about the country wanting me to run for the presidency, and I said, I have no interest in running for the presidency. I'm a soldier. I have the war to win, and I have no interest. Thank you, but definitively no thank you. And that was, I thought, the end of the matter. Now, it's still bandied about me running for presidency, but I will tell you, I'm a Southern, I have a job to do. I have no interest in being the president of the United States. That's a thankless job in which I want nothing to do. But Congress gave me the Lieutenant General. I was called to Washington City. But before I left Nashville, Tennessee, where I had my headquarters, I met with Sherman. And Sherman said, well, I will not quote what Sherman said. Lightning bolts. But Sherman made it clear, don't you do it. And I said, I've got to. And he said, if you go to Washington City, he gave me another good custom, you're going to get lost in the politics of the day. You're going to be consumed by trading politicians. You're going to get swallowed up and you will lose your purpose. And I said, no, I will not. So I left him and I went to Washington City. I got there on the 8th. I had Fred with me, had Rollins with me. And we went into the White House in the morning of the 8th. And I was given in a brief ceremony. I think President Lincoln's message was about 35 or 40 words, and mine were even less. He had told me the day before, he gave me a list of people to thank. He told me to praise the Army of the Potomac, because you're going to be coming east to the eastern theater. Praise the Army of the Potomac. I want to put aside all the concern about the Army of Tennessee and in the western theater. Soothe the feelings. He told me what he wanted me to say. I wrote it down. I said, thank you very much, Mr. President. Tucked it in my waistcoat pocket, went home to the hotel, and promptly ignored what he said. Right. My response was about 28, 30 words, something like that. Now, I did thank the men who had fought, but I didn't say what President Lincoln wanted me to say. He never said anything to me about that afterwards, and I became the Lieutenant General. The next day, I launched on what was become the Overland Campaign. I went out to see George, and he was waiting for me, Commander John Potomac. He was waiting for me, dressed very nicely. In fact, it looked like he was ready to step down. And in our meeting, he told me, he had his letter of resignation, and he told me, perhaps you, and I was on the fence about replacing George. But George Meade was a good man. But I was still thinking about replacing him. And he said, perhaps you've got somebody that you'd rather have commanding the Army of the Potomac. And if you do, I will step aside. Then he said what I wanted to hear. I wasn't anticipating it. I wasn't looking for it, but I wanted to hear it. He said, perhaps you want somebody else to be in command of this army. And if you do, I will step aside, because it is more important that we win the war than any one man. When he said that, I thought, you are the man. And I said, George, you will remain in command of the Army of the Potomac. I can't say for sure, but I think he was greatly relieved that I did not relieve him. So I left George in command. I also told him, I will keep my headquarters close to yours. I am not going to have my headquarters with yours. I want no confusion as to who is in command in the Army of the Potomac, because you must remember, I'm General-in-Chief. I'm in command of all the armies, nearly 1 million men. And my plan was, which I'll elaborate on, but plan was to have Ben Butler. Oh, and I need to say something about Ben. There is much I could say about that. But Ben Butler was a political appointee, and he had learned his job only by the hardest and at the cost of many lives, because he was not a professional soldier. President Lincoln appointed 173 political generals. And, well, he appointed 100 because he needed the support. The Army was exploding. When the war started, there were 16,500 officers and men. From Atlantic to Pacific, Mexico to Canada, 16,500. 1,500 officers, 15,000 men. The Army grew to, by the end of the war, which I hope will be soon from this day, to 2.1 million men. That's 1,000 enlistments a day, every day, from April the 12th of 1861 to April the 9th of 1865. 1,000 men a day. The Army exploded. We needed generals, particularly we needed brigadier generals, because they're your lowest level. They were using about 4,000 men. But we needed administrative generals. The Army was exploding and we needed leadership. So President Lincoln at first scooped up all the men with any Army experience, and then he started appointing men who he wanted to support what he was doing with the war effort. Because he had a war Congress that first couple of years. Now here in 1864, he does not have that war Congress. People at home felt like they turned out the rascals. And now we've got either in the war Democrats or on the fence Democrats. They'd like to win, but the bloodshed, the cost is too high. So he's dancing to a band that's off tune in trying to win the war. But he appointed political generals, and Butler was one of them. And he's over at the Army of the James, and I want him to go down and take Richmond. I want Nathaniel Banks, another appointee, to go in and take the Gulf Coast, Mobile, Alabama, which is, at the time I took command, one of the two major rebel gun runner force, blockade runner force. We did close that. And I'm having to dance with him. I'm having to dance with Butler. Franz Siegel, the German, he's another political appointee. Of course, he's got a lot of soldiers in Germany who don't speak English. The only thing that they can say in English is, "I fight with Siegel." And of course, Siegel spoke fluent German, and he commanded them, so he's a political appointee. And I went from the Western Theater with generals that are West Point graduates to the Eastern Theater with generals in leadership positions who are political appointees. And the landscape for me changed. Moreover, the objection that I had expressed to the president, even in private, going into the Army in the Eastern Theater, I don't know anybody. In the Western Theater, I know who can do what. And I will assign him. You do this, you do that, because it's what you do best. Coming east, I didn't know who could do what. And I will tell you, as you may already know, and as you read, I had to skip around to find people who could indeed do what I wanted them to do. And it was a long, arduous, and extremely deadly process to find leadership. I had so many political appointed generals, many of them good men, not many of them good military leaders. So I went out and I saw George, and I decided to keep George Meade in command of the Army of the Potomac. I told George, I will keep my headquarters near you, but not with you. I don't want any confusion. I'm commanding all armies of the United States, from Siegel in the Valley, Shenandoah Valley, Banks on the Gulf, and Butler over on the river in Virginia, and then we got Sherman going into Atlanta. So I've got all these armies coordinated. President Lincoln has made it clear he wanted me with the Army. I wanted to stay in Chattanooga, perhaps in Nashville, Tennessee, but President Lincoln shook that brave head of his. He said, "No, you're going to be here. I want your hand on the reins." So of course, I said, "Yes, Mr. President." The correct answer, and he says united. In fact, in the orders that he wrote after I got the Lieutenant General rank, that did not make me commander of the armies. A couple of days later, that President Lincoln wrote the orders directing that I would be Commander-in-Chief, or General-in-Chief, commanding all the United States armies, and it's in italics, with his headquarters in the field. I was expected to travel with the Army. President Lincoln said, "I want your hand on those reins. I want your presence, because we have not been successful." Secretary of War Stanton started to tell me what the problem is. Mr. Lincoln said, no, sir. You and I, Mr. Stanton, have tried to run this war for 3 years, and we have not done well. Let the man run the Army like he sees fit. And of course, there was some choking noise out of Stanton's throat. And he and I were at loggerheads much of the time. In fact, I had ordered shortly thereafter, before we went to the field, I ordered all of the heavy artillery out of Washington, D.C. Did you know Washington, D.C. was the most heavily fortified city in the world? And I looked around those miles and miles of heavy artillery and batteries, and I said, "You need to be in the field, because we're going after Lee." And in fact, I had told Sherman in Nashville, Tennessee, before I came east to actually launch, I said, "You're going to go after Joe Johnston. I'm going to send Banks down the river, James River, and take the Appomattox, Richmond if we can. And I'm going to send Nathaniel or the Siegel down to the Shenandoah Valley." And Sherman said, "And where are you going to be?" And I said, "I'm going to be with the Army of the Potomac, and we're going to keep Lee in Virginia." Because as you probably well know, but perhaps not at this time of war, we were very afraid that Lee was going to slip away from us and go down and join Joe Johnston. And I was determined, my primary objective, certainly get Richmond if I could, but Richmond had no value for me. The Trinidad Iron Works was there, to be sure. But the primary value with taking Richmond was the moral value of taking the Confederate capital. And I was much more concerned with pinning Lee in Virginia so he couldn't get away. Lee wanted to leave Virginia, but Jefferson Davis told him, "You stay in Virginia." So Lee always stayed between me and Richmond. Wherever we went in this campaign, or wherever it may go from here at Massaponax Church, Lee, as much as he'd like to go south and join Joe Johnston, Lee is always a buffer between the Army of the Potomac and Richmond. Lee chafed at that. He wanted to go and fight. But the President Davis was there. So I suspect I'll be approaching him and fighting him. If I can get Richmond, that will be good. But Richmond is not my primary target. My primary target is to engage Lee. I want to move into Virginia and grab him by the throat and hold him. If I can kill him, I will. If I can take that army out of the fight, I will. But for the moment, keep him by the throat and hold him. That was what I had in mind while the peripheral activities went on. We crossed the Rapidan and came into the wilderness. Now, I could have gone south and through the plains. And you may wonder why I do not. Now, are there any journalists here? least nobody's admitting to this. There was one rascal that liked to hide. You know, I like to sit around the campfire and have a cup of coffee. I'm an inveterate coffee drinker. And there's this one particular rascal that would hide off somewhere out of sight, out of the light of the campfire. And I wondered for several days, a couple of weeks, how was all of my information that I'm talking about around the campfire, how is it showing up in the Richmond newspapers and in the newspapers back home? Until somebody called and told him. And so I got him, so to speak, by the nape of the neck and his collar, and I ran him out of camp. I think he's still skulking around the outskirts, but he can't stay around the campfire. But we could have gone to the south and across the plains, but that would have required, and you may wonder why I didn't do it, that would have required a wagon train that would have been miles long. And I've got about 120,000 soldiers. I cleared out the heavy batteries. I'm talking about Stanton. When I cleared out the heavy batteries, Stanton showed up at my home and he said, "What are you doing?" And just about that manner. And I said, "About what?" And he said, "You're taking all the soldiers away from the batteries around Washington City." And I said, "They don't need to be there. It's the most heavily fortified city in history. I need those men to go into Virginia and face Lee." So I cleaned them out. And he said, "Well, we'll see about that." And I said, "Yes, we will." "What's your pleasure, Mr. Secretary?" "Go see President Lincoln." We did. I will tell you, we went in his carriage. That was the quietest ride through Washington City streets. We got to Mr. Lincoln and blustered in on him, and Stanton with his wild beard, he's strutting around and gesticulating and this and that with his sonorous voice and blah, blah, blah. And what I had done, I walked over to the corner of the room, took out a cigar, and I'm busy at work, I lit a cigar, and I'm sitting there smoking a cigar. And Stanton would come over to me and say, "Isn't that right, General? Isn't that right, General?" I said, "Look, yes. You want to take all those men out of here?" I already took them out. And after Stanton had run down President Lincoln, sitting in his sock feet with slip-on house shoes. Sitting lounged, he was draped over a chair, like a rope over a chair. And he stood up and gathered himself up and unfolded like a carpenter. And he walks over to Mr. Stanton and said, "Mr. Stanton, Mr. Secretary, I believe General Grant knows best what to do. And I think we should let General Grant run the Army as he sees fit." By this time, Stanton is talkative, red face, and choking, I think, gurgling. And I was over in the corner smoking my cigar and doing my best to suppress a smile. And when we marched out to go down to cross the Rapidan River, I did send several thousand of those heavy artillery. I did send several thousand back to appease Mr. Secretary Stanton. And President Lincoln, he had such a saved look about it. And President Lincoln looked at me and kind of nod, just almost imperceptibly, and I got the message. We spent too little time together, but I got to read it. And he'd stand there, just like the paintings and some of the photographs, he'd grasp those lapels and cock that head, and he looked down at me, because I'm 5'7", he was about 6'4", and he just kind of nodded. I think he might have winked. Not sure, but I did send some of them back. But we prepared to move across the Rapidan. Now, Henry Halleck, who had been General in Chief, happily, at least he said, happily, stepped aside for me to take command. I believe I'm probably the least likely person to have succeeded him in command that he could have thought of. Perhaps I'll find out more about that later. I like the man, and I talked with the president, and I suggested that we make Hallett sort of a chief of staff. There was no such rank, but a chief of staff. Hallett was not a field soldier. He, make no mistake, he is a brilliant, strategic person, brilliant man. But he's an office man. And I put him in Washington City to handle everything there with the Army's world. Remember, I'm not in command of the Army of the Potomac. I always want to clarify that. I'm not in command of the Army of the Potomac. Not yet. And I need somebody to coordinate all the activities from the Gulf of Mexico to the Shenandoah Valley. So I had Howard in Washington City, and I was in the field. Well, Howard gave me some good advice. For example, well, it's in the future, but perhaps we can look into the future a little bit. When I put Phil Sheridan in charge of the cavalry, and which was a good move. And in fact, Howard, at least he takes credit for having suggested putting Sheridan in command. I had Sheridan in mind. Remember, Sheridan is an infantry officer until I put him on a horse. But it turned out that that was a good move. But as we prepared to move across the Rapidan, I had that southern route. But I didn't want that because the supply line would have stretched many, many miles. And as we went into Virginia, I would have to have more and more men behind guarding those wagon trains that would supply 120,000 men. And that would siphon off force that I needed on the front line. And I intended for there to be a front line. I wanted Lee to come out and give me battle. He never did. Oh, he fought me. We fought all over Virginia. But Lee never came out and gave me battle. I'd like to say he knew better. But what I must say is he had about half the size of the army that I had. And while they were valiant, make no mistake now, Army of Northern Virginia of the best. And I say that not as a traitor. I say that to respect one of the greatest armies that was ever in the field. But I wanted him to give me back in the open, which he never did. But when we began to move across, Halleck asked me, when are you moving? And I had it right here in my pocket, my orders. And it wasn't until May the 3rd when I put out the orders, because there are spies everywhere. There may be spies in here today listening to me. I would ask you to stand up, but you probably wouldn't. All I had to do to find out what I was going to do the next day was get the Richmond papers. And I could read everything I'm supposed to be doing, everything indeed I planned to do in the Richmond newspapers. Yeah, some of the northern newspapers. But we began to move that across that river. Well, I decided to go the northern route through the wilderness. About 70 square miles of scrub, brush, and trees. It had been tilled, it had been fertile farmland, tobacco I think it was, but tobacco completely sucks everything out of the ground. And the Virginia planters from the 1700s had moved on. What became the wilderness was former farmland. And the trees grew up with a canopy so thick that in many places in the wilderness, there's a reason it's called the wilderness. The sun didn't hit the ground. And then the brush, heavily forested in many places, just a couple of roads, one-lane roads. In fact, once we got across the river, I sent about half my artillery back because all they were doing was clogging the roads. And I thought, well, when I need them, I'll get them. I need them more than I thought I did. quick to call them back, but they were clogging the roads. I had some 50,000 horses and mules. 50,000. I had 400, the quartermaster tells me 435. Rufus Engels. Ruth tells me I had 435 wagons, 50,000 horses and mules, and an entire several thousand head of cattle that were kept on the hook till we needed to slaughter them to eat. And 100, some numbers, most of them hit around 120,000 men. The wagon train was so long, there were so many wagons, that if you had put them horse to wagon, it would have been 90 miles long. The first wagon would have been going into Richmond city limits while the last wagons were still in Washington city. And then you got 50,000, well, about 45,000 horses and about 5,000 mules. And then I think 615 ambulance wagons. I anticipated needing them. And when we began to move on the night of the 4th, about midnight, by the next morning at daylight, I had my command staff, and I found a promontory near a road. The road went down beside us. The head of the men were about where our horses' hooves were, and I was dressed as you see me now. And I even had a sash on and a sword. I don't wear a sword. I hadn't worn a sword since Shiloh. Sword bullet hit me in the left side, caught me right under the sword pommel, and almost broke it in half, bruised my leg. It would have shattered my head if I hadn't had the sword on. By the end of the day, it fell off, and all I had was the pommel of the sword. And I said, I don't wear a sword anymore, and all it does is bruise my leg and bother the horse. And if people don't know who I am, then there's no need for them to know, is there? And I wear a private blouse with just shoulder straps to indicate my rank. Much of the time I wear civilian clothes. In fact, I was able to walk through the camps at Vicksburg in civilian clothes, much like what you wear. And I walked through the camp, and as I went through the camp, there'd be a weight behind me when people would say, "That's him!" That was him! No, it wasn't. No, Grant's bigger than that. I just smiled, smoked a cigar, and keep on walking, because I wanted to be on the ground and see what was in that camp. But I had on my sword, and I had on my dress uniform, my frock coat, and I was on Cincinnati. Big fellow, about 17 hands high. Big fellow, magnificent animal. And I was sitting my horse, and the conversation behind me, Porter, one of them, they were saying, "Why is he here? What's he doing?" Many of them had never even seen me with a frock coat. And Porter said, "Well, he's wanting to review the troops." My feeling was, most of these men had never seen me. And I want some of them at least to see me dressed as you see me this day. Of course, within a couple of days, I was back. One officer on my staff described me by the end of that week as being dressed, looking like a primitive farmer going in the bank to cash a check. And I took no note of that. People asked me, don't you want to look official? I said, I don't have any need to look official. I am the commanding general. If anybody else doesn't know that, then they don't really need to know, do they? The people who need to know. So we marched past them, and one of the men said, wouldn't it be interesting for each man who was going to be killed to have some kind of badge? As it turned out, by the end, I must slip time a bit and talk about the end of the campaign when we back Lee into the trenches at Petersburg. By the end of the campaign, I had 50,000 men killed or wounded. Half of that army that went across the Rapidan were killed or wounded in the next 5 weeks. Lee, I had 120,000. Lee had about 65, the best estimates that I can get, and I've got spies everywhere too. The best estimate I can get, Lee's got either 65 or 65,000 men. Lee had almost that entire army killed and wounded. Now, we both had, Lee, for the last time, was able to get reinforcements, so by the time we backed him into the trenches at Petersburg, Lee still had that many troops. It was, as it turned out, his last gasp to get that many recruits and staff his army. And I had replaced my troops back to where when we backed Lee into Petersburg, at the end of the campaign, we both had what we started out with, just shortly before we came here where you sit this day. The blood was knee deep. Well, I crossed the Rapidan, had 2 bridges, and 5 pontoon bridges. One of the longest pontoon bridges ever, at least at that point, I think ever. And we spent all night on the 4th crossing those troops. And finally, I was asked, you want to go through the wilderness? You see, I didn't think Lee would hit me in the wilderness. Because I felt Lee's got as much to lose as I do in that wilderness, in that green hell, as it turned out, where the sun don't shine in too much of the area. Lee had another idea about it, and he decided that hitting me in the wilderness would compensate for his only having half the men I had. And as it turned out, I cannot argue with that. So, on the morning of the 5th, Lee finally hit me. I'm still bringing troops across. I've got more troops than 9th Corps, Burnside with the 9th Corps as a rear guard. And that I'm going to tell you here. Burnside, remember, he's been one of the commanders of the Army of the Potomac. He outright beat me, which was a ticklish situation. Because if I had Burnside with me, with his 9th Corps, meaning of the USCT, then he'd be under me's command. And I had Burnside as my rear guard. Well, once we got in, across the river, most of the troops, on the morning of the 5th, Lee hit me. And what became known as, I've heard different names, some of which I can't repeat from the veterans who fought in it, but the Battle of the Wilderness, I think, is the best term. And for the next 2 days, it was hell on earth. But I finally called Burnside over, and he finally got over. That's a whole other day. I was thinking about Burnside dragging his sword. And we commenced fighting Lee. Now, for the next several days, we were in the 2 days in the wilderness, and then we pushed on to Spotsylvania Courthouse. Now, at that point, I must needs bring my comments to a close. I think I've set out for you where I am and what I've been trying to do with the Army. Who I've got in command, who I don't really want in command, but they are in command, and the launching of the Overland Campaign, the 2 days in the wilderness, 2 days in hell, as the soldiers call it. Now, at this time, I would be happy to entertain questions, if any of you should have a question.